Each year our President of the United States gives us the State of the Union address. We also have it, our governor gives the address to the state. And so I was looking through the studying over the last few weeks, kind of came across the same thing when David, basically, when he writes a couple of Psalms, and he's talking about the state of the union of his country. And so by using Psalms 10 and Psalms 12, I like for us to look at the state of the union as I see it of our country, and then what you and I can do to help along the way. So think about it, just to give you a background. In Psalms 9, which we saw that in Psalms 119, which is an acrostic psalm. We never went through all that. That each letter of the Hebrew alphabet is how he starts different verses. In Psalms 9 and Psalms 10 formed most of an acrostic psalm. Psalms 9 is written by David, and it shows problems that are from other nations surrounding him. In Psalms 10, we don't really know who wrote it. Either David wrote it because it's a continuation of the acrostic, or somebody read Psalms 9, and basically from the A through K, David wrote in Psalms 9, and whoever the author is 10 then took up from L through Z and did. But I like for us to kind of combine Psalms 10 and Psalms 12, and you'll see how we can kind of go between the two and look at it. So let's look at it. That's kind of the background that you see in the problems. Remember, 9 is talking about problems outside, and Psalms 10 talks about problems within. So let's look at it in Psalms 10 and then also in Psalms 12. And notice that in Psalms 10, verse 1, you have questioning God. You notice in verse 1 of chapter 10, "Why dost thou stand afar off, O Lord? Why dost thou hide thyself in times of trouble?" Do any of us question God in his methods? Have any of you, maybe I would be a better phrase, have any of you not questioned God at some of the time, I think? They're questioning God, why are you not doing something? I've had Don ask me at different times, man, I don't know why, and Grady has too, it's the same thing. I have been amazed that God hasn't judged our country. Why has God not? And we obviously know based on 2 Peter part of why, but still you wonder why God hasn't. So he's doing it. Now I think, first of all, when we think of a righteous person, which is who's the one asking this question, we're going to define righteous person based on Psalms 1. You remember, he doesn't stand, sit, or walk with the counsel of the ungodly, but he is in the then walking in accordance to the Word of God. So that's what we're referring to as a righteous person. But here they're standing off and they're wondering, God, all this is going on in our country. Why are you not doing something? They're questioning. So notice he's disillusioned. Disillusionment and questioning is not bad. It's just where we go in the next part. In Revelation 6, you remember when the martyrdom, one of the seal judgments, when martyrdom in chapter 6, verse 9 to 11, they're in heaven and during the tribulation, they say what? Oh Lord, when are you going to what? Avenge our blood. And he says to wait. Asking the question why or what you're doing is one thing, but we need to be like the psalmist here, is we're still going to trust him. I think what happens, we sometimes question, but then we start questioning or asking the wrong question. Questioning is one thing, but what question are you asking? And let's see if we can get to the right question to be asking. So notice then they're disillusioned. And then also notice in Psalms 12 and verse 1, they're disappearing. Notice in verse 1, David also wrote this one. He says, "Help, Lord, for the godly man ceases to be, for the faithful disappear from the sons of men." So in Psalms 10, he's disillusioned. In Psalms 12, he said the righteous people are disappearing. Would you agree that it seems like righteous people in America are disappearing? Yes. Not having as many. But I think it's important to remember, in the middle of the disappearing and the disillusionment, we have to be careful not to be like Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. What did he say? "Oh, poor me, I alone am left to follow you," right? And in verse 18, God says, no, there's 7,000 others who still haven't bowed the knee. So I think it's important. We can sometimes think there's nobody, but there are others who are following. So questioning God is one thing, but I think it's important to change our question. Think about it in Daniel 3 when Glenn spoke on it. Did the three in the book of Daniel, thrown into the fiery furnace, did they question God? Did Daniel question God in chapter 1 when he was taken off into captivity? Did Daniel question God when he's thrown into the lions? Why not? Why in the book of Acts, when they were being punished for serving God, did they question? Or did they rejoice that they were considered worthy to suffer? So an interesting question, I think it'd be better to ask, am I asking the right questions? Not why am I here, but what can I do for you when I am here? It's a very big different question to ask. You have seen to it and put me in here. What can I learn from it, and how can I better represent you during it? Because obviously, if we're told to be light, in a dark world, then He's placed us in a dark world on purpose to be the light. So we can be questioning God, but let's make sure we're asking the right questions. So be thinking about that. Are you going to be the next Daniel or Esther for your people? Or are we going to just simply question all the time? There's always things you can question all the time. Because if we're really questioning the wrong way, we're basically saying what? God, I am God, and you have got to answer it for me because I'm in charge, and you have to make it make sense to me. And God's ways are not my ways, nor is His thoughts my thoughts. So we have to be careful. So notice the first one is they're questioning God. Back in Psalms 10 and then also in 12, talking about the world with which David lived, as well as in our world, they're rejecting God. They're going to reject Him in 4 ways. In verse 2 to 4 of chapter 10, notice the first one, what they're going to do. They're going to say there isn't a God. Notice in verse 2 to 4, in the pride the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. So notice the first sin they have of this part is pride. Isn't that what 1 John tells us? The pride of life, lust of the fist, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Isn't that what got the Satan in trouble in Isaiah 14? Does pride get people in trouble at all today? No, I'm not lost. I'm just taking the scenic route, right? Well, it's amazing how many times we won't admit things because of pride. Pride is a real problem, and was here too. Notice the second one. Remember, we're going to look further. Notice in verse 3. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses and spurns the Lord. He takes his whole emphasis is on his personal pleasures. His pleasure is a problem in our culture today. Basically, if you want it, what? Go buy it. If you don't have the money, you do what? You charge it. In some way down the way, you're going to keep charging, but eventually you're somehow going to get out of this thing. I don't know how, but anyway. It's just amazing the personal pleasures. You just keep going and buying and doing things. I'll never forget being in line with somebody, and they're literally, this is a side note, they were charging. And they're writing a hot check. Well, I know it's a hot check, but it's actually better. And they're only going to charge me $30 for the hot check, but if I don't write this check, they're going to charge me $50 for a late fee, so I'm actually coming out ahead. Okay, why don't you pay them right at the beginning? Is that really, why they turned to me to tell me that, I don't know. So notice, there's pride is a problem, pleasures is a problem. Then notice down in verse 4 of verse 10, the wicked in the haughtiness of his countenance does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. So notice the first thing on talking about the rejecting God, they don't believe there is a God. In America today, would you agree that we are practicing atheists as a nation? We are practicing atheists. We don't believe there's a God out there who's going to judge. I'm talking about when I look at our nation. He's just off. He just basically created, let it go. If they even believe in God, they don't think there's anything you have to go. So notice the same thing has happened in David's day. People are saying there isn't a God. And so I think it's interesting when you stop and you think about there isn't a God. Am I living for the line or the dot as a Christian? We can also say I believe there's a God, but then I'm living for the line. Personal pride, pleasures, everything else. Notice the second thing when they reject God, they do in verse 5 down to verse 7. Notice in verse 5, His ways prosper at all times. Thy judgments are on high out of His sight. I like to call this large and in charge. How many people feel that way about their life? You know? Hey, I'm in charge of my life. I'll do whatever I want. God's not there. He's out of sight. He doesn't care. And how many people do you run across that believe they're large and in charge? I mean, I've had statements at work, you know, that we're coming to Jesus meeting and I'm Jesus. No, you're not. And different stuff like that. Basically, they believe they're in charge on everything. Notice you have a little further. Go down to verse 6, which is interesting too. He says himself, I shall not be moved. So basically you're saying what? Hey, I'm building this thing and nobody's going to move me. I'm in charge and you can't move me. How many times do we think God can't move us? God will bring a storm. He can move you however He wants to move you. And so I think it's but they think in their own minds that they are large and in charge, they're unmovable, that nobody can do anything that they don't agree to or allow or whatever. Go down a little bit further in verse 7. They have the language of deception. Notice it's interesting in verse 7. His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. So in other words, he's two-faced. You ever have two-faced people? What about when you go a little bit further? He goes on, his tongue is mischief and wickedness. He sits in the lurking places of the village. His hiding places he kills the innocent. It's interesting. He's two-faced. He's double-tongued. And he's silver-tongued. You ever have any of those? Go over to chapter 12 and verse 4. Who says, with our tongues we shall prevail, our lips are our own. Who is Lord over us? We can say and do whatever we want, right? That's what they're saying. So you think about it, I shall not be moved. Basically, the language of deception. They're two-faced, they're double-tongued, and they're silver-tongued. You ever had bosses that tell you one thing and they mislead you intentionally because of something else? It's amazing how that happens. Our whole world is full of that. So I want you to think about it, just talking about there isn't a God. That was one that we had. So am I living for the God? Here, I shall not be moved. Do others see when they are evaluating you and I, do they ever use the words, he's double-tongued, or he has a silver tongue, or he's two-faced? It's interesting, you think about it. Or how would they describe you? Would they call you true blue, or they call you silver-tongued? Well, how would they describe it? And so I think it's important to think about it, because that's a question. Notice how that David is describing the people he's around. So it's not how we would describe ourselves, but how do others describe us. So notice, I shall not be moved. Notice when you get to verse 8, we have, if there isn't a God, I shall not be moved. And we have this a lot in 8 to 11. And basically, people don't believe God sees it. Notice in verse 8, he sits in the lurking places on the village. In the hiding places, he kills the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the unfortunate. He's sitting up on a perch. Where I'm at the refinery, I see this all the time. I see the eagles up on perch, bald eagles. I also see all kinds of red hawks and so on. They're on the perch. What are they on the perch for? They're waiting. They're waiting for the turtle to move. Or I see them catch the snakes and the rabbits and everything else, and interesting, watch them take off in their talons when they're doing it. Notice that's how he's describing the people here. They're lurching, they're sitting on their perch waiting to pounce on unsuspecting people. We have a culture where that happens, where people are trying to take advantage of it. In business, they'll take advantage when some company's in trouble. You see it happen with a person financially, a person takes advantage of it. We hear it all the time when people are calling. How many of you, I think Tommy was telling me last week, people call and saying, you're in trouble with the IRS, you do this, send the check here and you'll do this. People are sitting on their perch just lurching all the time, trying to take advantage, and they often will do that with people. Notice their patterns in 9 down in verse 10, their pattern. He lurks in a hiding place as a lion in his lair. He lurks to catch the afflicted. He catches the afflicted when he draws him into his net. He crouches, he bows down, and the unfortunate fall by his mighty ones. So notice what is he doing? His pattern. He's just sitting there lurking like a lion. Who does the lion attack? The weak, and they also attack the straggler when he gets away. Well, isn't that what we're told that Satan is doing to us too in 1 Peter? So it's one of the reasons why we need to assemble together and we need to be together. We need each other. So we're not out there getting discouraged, getting weighed down, doing everything up, and then we become prey through the enemy and so on, through our own discouragement or whatever it might be. So notice you have this, he's perched, he has a pattern. Notice the perception. Why is he doing all this? I think we need to keep real clear what his thinking is in verse 11. Notice what it says. He says to himself, God is forgotten, he has hid his face, he will never see it. So I can do whatever I want because God will forget about it, or he doesn't see me to begin with. And how many times do we have people doing things because they don't think people see it? You know, people look both ways and they don't see it. It reminds me when I was playing basketball and we were playing against a team up in North Carolina. And I'll never forget when we came back and watched the game film afterward, and I had a teammate. I don't know why, he's never done anything like that before or after in any game, but we run down and you see his face. He looks this way, he looks that way. Ref wasn't looking, there's an opponent on the floor, reaches up his foot and just stomps on the guy. Well, isn't that kind of what we're doing here? The enemy's doing the same thing. They're out here looking and they don't think God sees them. But how many people honestly would do dishonest things all the time because they don't think God is watching or that God cares? But how many of us, before we get too critical, do you and I say things we shouldn't be saying? Because we don't think God's going to do anything. Or we should be doing things for people, but we don't because we're going to let somebody else do it or we don't think God really cares. So I think about it, you know, when we look at it, does God really care or does he see me? And so, question we can do. How many of us have ever done something because we think we can ask for God's forgiveness because he's a gracious God? I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to say, God, forgive me. Anybody ever done that? I see 2 hands. At least we got a couple of honest ones. We need to be careful, but we know he is a merciful God. But don't forget, he does see. He does see. Notice the next thing you have in verse 12 and 13 of chapter 10, that you have, Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thy hand, do not forget the afflicted. Why has the wicked spurned God? Notice what it says. He has said to himself, Thou wilt not require of it. So what does the wicked say? He doesn't see me, or if he does, he isn't going to judge me. How many today really believe that God will not judge them? They either don't believe he sees, that he doesn't care, but at least they don't believe he'll judge. And I think in their practice that's very, very true of what they're doing. And it's amazing. So question they misunderstand God. You know, in 2 Peter 3, it's what we're told there, why has God waited, not punished? Because he's not willing that any should perish. He's giving them more and more time. Why hasn't he done things? He's given them more time. Why has he not punished you and I? He's given us time to do what? To repent. But don't ever think that he won't judge. I think oftentimes we play on his mercy and his grace, and we need to ask ourselves and look at ourselves correctly, because he is seeing. So notice then, these are the different things that are going on. You remember they're rejecting God, and we talk about rejecting God. Remember they did in 4 ways, basically, what the statements you saw here. 1, they say there's no God. 2, they're saying what? I won't be moved. 3, God doesn't see me. And then 4, God doesn't judge me. I won't judge me. So what should you and I do? And I think it's interesting when you see it. What we need to do starts in verse 14, and that is trusting God in the middle of all this. So notice in verse 14 what he says. God sees what's going on. Thou hast seen it, for thou hast beheld mischief and vexation. Mischief would be their outward acts. Vexation would be their inward thoughts. That's an interesting, I'm glad it's in there. God sees their actions, but he also knows their thoughts. I think it's important to remember that because in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 5, you and I are told, let God judge because he knows the man's motive of their heart. You and I don't. People can do things that are good, but doing it for the wrong motive. You and I don't know. God knows what they're doing, but he also knows the motive why they're doing it. So let's let him do it. And so I think it's interesting, outward and inward. And I think it's interesting, too, he talks about he's helping the helpless, the unfortunate commit to him. Isn't he the father to the fatherless? Isn't that what he says? So when you and I pick on the orphan and the fatherless, who are we actually asking are going to battle against? And so often people are taking advantage of people who are in financial difficulties, whatever it might be, in orphans or whatever it might be. When we do that, we're asking for God's judgment. We're going against it. So I think it's important to keep it. Notice then when you get into verse 15, we need to see that God, recognize God knows what's going on. But in verse 15, God does judge sin. And notice in 15, it's interesting, break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Well, that's it's a term used for strength. If you're breaking the arm, they're not going to be able to go to work, they're not going to be able to do things. So basically, the author is asking God to judge him. But how many of us want telling God how to do it and when to do it? It's one thing to say, God, do it, but do it in your time. And it's another thing to say, God, do it and do it my way and do it in my time. But notice he's basically saying God to judge him. And I think it's an interesting, seek out his wickedness until thou dost find none. That's amazing you think about it. God, you see it, you judge it, but you know all what's going on. You and I do not know what goes on behind closed doors. So think about it. How much are you willing to let God, are you willing to trust God's eyesight in his time? How many of you think you need to type a letter to him because he didn't see that, what happened to you, right? You don't think he sees what happens. Or you don't think his timing is like it should be. And I think it's, for all of us, that happens at times. People, like with Jessie when she was a person ran a red light and hit her. He comes out and says, I'm sorry, it was my fault. Well, the police don't do a report, and the broken arrow said we no longer assign guilt. So what happens when the insurance gets involved? Story changes. So we have to end up paying for a car. But does God see it? So do I have to turn it over and say, God, you got to judge it? So it happens in every one of us, in every one of our lives, all the time. God will judge. We have to turn it over to him. Notice then also in 17 down to 19, not only will God judge sin, but God also will defend. And I think we need to turn it over and let God defend us. Notice in 17, Lord, thou dost hear the desire of the humble. Thou wilt strengthen their hearts. Thou wilt incline their ears to vindicate the orphan and the oppressed, that the man who is on earth may cause terror no more. How many of us are willing to let God defend? How many of us are willing to let God defend? Or how many of us want to defend ourselves? We want to defend ourselves until the opponent gets too great, right? And then we want to go call on all our buddies. But we want this. So it's interesting. God hears us in 17. He helps in 18. And I think it's important in Romans 12. Remember, we're told in verse 17 and 19, don't take vengeance yourself. Let God take vengeance. And that's very, very difficult. Because there comes times when you have an opportunity later on to get even with someone. If you work at a place long enough, you will probably get an opportunity sooner or later to get even with somebody who has done things wrong. And we have to be a better person to let God do it. Let God do it. And then notice in chapter 12 in verse 8, I think it's interesting how they, you have it in verse 6 down to 8. I didn't read the 6th part, I should have. But notice the words of the Lord are pure. The silver tried in the furnace on the earth, refined 7 times. Thou, O Lord, will keep them. Okay, and what did the enemy say about God's word? They're not real, it's not for today, and he says it's refined and it is pure. you and I can go to the bank on God's Word. So we can trust Him. If He said He'll judge him, He'll judge him. If He says He'll help us, He'll help us. So yeah, we can see how bad everything's going on in our country, but we need to trust God's Word. And then notice it says He will defend. It's interesting in verse 8 what happens. The wicked strut on every side when vileness is exalted among the sons of men. What have they done? They've replaced God in our culture. If you don't believe it, just look in Romans chapter 1, and it makes the statement in verse 24, 26, and 28. They dishonor their bodies, they have degrading passions, and they have a depraved mind. I think that fits our culture real well today. Because they replaced it all. But God sees it, so what can you and I do? If that's the culture we're in, we can be a light. So let's think about it. Questions. Who do I listen to and associate with? We're getting bombarded all the time on all the different news stuff and everywhere you have. Work and everything else. Who do I listen to? And am I, like Psalms 1, listening to the Word, or am I listening to everything else? Second question, how would others describe me? Double-tongued or true blue? And then ultimately, how would God describe me? Am I taking advantage of God's mercy? I think it's easy to do. Will I trust God's eyesight and His time? Again, you think about it, if David was writing this while he's running away from Saul all the time, do you think he was getting a little tired? I'm supposed to be the king. God, when are you going to take Saul out? I'm tired of running. Everybody else is getting exalted, doing things, and I'm doing everything right, and I'm not doing what he's doing. I'm not lying, doing these things. When are you going to do it? God does. But how many years did David run around? And you think about it, how much of his life was he running? But how many Psalms did he write and get into a good relationship with the Lord as the true shepherd while he was doing it? Are we becoming better in the midst of it? Or are we becoming bitter? Are we becoming bitter? Are we becoming bitter? Are we becoming bitter?